You are now listening to the Counterflow Podcast, a place for dissonant voices and unapproved opinions.
You get split in half, but I call the hologram graph. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid, and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Here is your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson.
What's up, you guys? Welcome back once again to the Counterflow Podcast. As always, I'm your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson, coming to you out of Lockhart, Texas. And it's a good evening, a good day to talk all things beauty, architecture, ugliness, modernity, Orthodox church design, and everything that falls into all of these categories with none other than Andrew Gould. If you're not familiar with him, well, you're going to like this episode. I'm pretty certain because, well, you'll see. Before we get into it, I should say, if you are a member of my exclusive club over at patreon.com/counterflow, where for $5 or more per month, you're in this club, and there's a lot of you out there. I apologize for not getting our monthly Zoom done in November, but the special guest is waiting on permission from his bishop, so that'll probably give you a hint as to what type of guest. And it is my intention to do 2 special Zoom calls this month of December so I can make it up to you guys. And again, if you'd like to get in on that club, patreon.com/counterflow, $5 or more per month gets you in. Now, on to this discussion with Andrew Gould on modernity, ugliness, beauty, history, design, architecture, art, the Orthodox Church, and so on, and your soul. How does it all affect your soul? We're getting there. Andrew Gould, the man over at newworldbyzantine.com, is here, and he's an artisan and designer specializing in traditional buildings and liturgical art. We get into that phrase, liturgical art. He studied art history. He's got a master's of architecture degree from University of Pennsylvania. He started practicing in Charleston, South Carolina in 2004. He designs beautiful, beautiful churches, beautiful houses, just beautiful buildings in general. And if you look around at these ugly, gray, slanted, odd-shaped, modern buildings and houses and it offends you, well, the future could be bright. He's also on the board of a college that specializes in getting young people, or old, I suppose, these 4-year bachelor degrees in this exact type of beautiful design to counter all the ugly modern buildings that are going up quickly because, well, they can go quickly. They're not designed particularly well. They're not built particularly well. And we're going to get into all of that. So let's just get into it now. Andrew Gould, welcome to the show, sir. How are you?
Very well, thanks.
I'm happy to have you here. I believe the way I found out about your stuff, it's like one of those things where you find out a new word and then you start hearing it. I discovered you, I think, from Jonathan Pajot's website, where he might have had you as a recommendation of something that he likes to do or look at. And then, of course, I've heard you on his show. Then I start getting people randomly that I'm friends with saying, hey, have you heard of this guy? And I was like, well, yeah, I've been looking into him. I'd like to have him on the show. So I'm glad you're here. And I'll let you give the audience an intro for yourself, anything you think's pertinent. And then, of course, I've got a bunch of questions and we'll jump from there.
Well, sure. Well, the work that I do is design. I design Orthodox churches. I design houses and some commercial structures. And my work is all traditionally styled. I'm a member of the sort of revival of traditional classical architecture. And that makes Orthodox churches a really good fit for me. I actually ultimately converted to Orthodoxy in part because I realized that was a milieu in which there's people who really want beautiful traditional buildings. In fact, even medieval style buildings. And that's always been my love, is medieval liturgical architecture. And Orthodoxy allows me to kind of explore that artistic expression in a real practical sense, where people can really use and enjoy these buildings. So I've been doing this for about 20 years, and I traveled extensively, go to Europe almost every year, study old buildings, try to figure out how to build things like that with modern materials. And, it's been a really exciting journey.
I've heard you say that you're a liturgical artist, and I think I get what that means, and I love the term. Can you explain that?
Well, sure. It's because in churches in particular, there's not such a clear distinction between the architecture, meaning the design of the building, and the what you might call interior decorating in a domestic setting. That is to say, the furniture, the paintings, the carpets. They're kind of one and the same. So that for me to design an Orthodox church, it really means that I'm designing the furniture, the chandeliers, I'm picking out carpets, I'm coordinating with icon painters, and I have to kind of guide the aesthetic vision of every detail of the material space. And so, quite a lot of my time is not so much spent designing the building, but designing furniture and fixtures, advising clergy on other artists that they need to bring in, and so that's why I often introduce myself as a liturgical artist. I'm coordinating, many of these different liturgical arts.
We say in Orthodoxy, or at least I do, that it's not just a quote unquote religion, certainly not a denomination of one, but I say that it's a worldview. Am I correct in assuming that it shapes the way that you view architecture, or was it that the architecture view you had was already there and it happened to fit with Orthodoxy? How does that work for you?
Well, like I said, I've always been drawn to medieval architecture and church architecture. I've been saying I wanted to be an architect since I was 5 years old. And I was not raised Christian, but I found Christianity when I was 13 and started going to a high Episcopalian and Anglo-Catholic church, which comes from kind of typically the English Gothic aesthetic. And so I love all of these expressions of sort of medieval liturgical beauty. But what really struck me about Orthodoxy when I first encountered Orthodoxy and started visiting their services and their churches was that Orthodoxy has a really coherent understanding of the purpose of this liturgical art. The Western Church talks a lot about the importance of beauty, but they don't often talk about like why beauty, like why from a practical standpoint do you actually need beautiful churches in order to hold church services, and what exactly is that beauty trying to achieve? And this uncertainty about the specifics of beauty in the Western Church has kind of proven to be its undoing in modern times, because the Western Church has had a progression of experimental styles, from Romanesque to Gothic to Renaissance to Baroque to neoclassical, and then, ultimately crashing and burning with, the sort of nihilistic minimalism of 20th century modern church architecture. And in a Catholic context, it's hard to say why any of those styles is right or wrong, because they don't have a really coherent theology of liturgical art. Experimentation is fair game. Whereas in the Orthodox Church, there's been a consensus from the beginning to the present day that churches sort of work a certain way aesthetically. That is to say that the inside of the church is essentially an icon of the kingdom of heaven. That all of the arts work together to basically present an impression of actually stepping into the New Jerusalem. And so the icons proper, the paintings of saints, they are simply part of this overall icon. And we put those paintings of saints all around us in the church, all on the walls and the ceiling, is to give the impression that we have stepped into heaven and that we are surrounded by the hosts of heaven, who worship among us. And the structure of the building is sort of meant to represent the city of God, the New Jerusalem, that the book of Revelation describes the New Jerusalem in a lot of detail. It describes it as being essentially a giant cube in its proportions, and that the walls and foundations are made of precious gemstones, and the doors are made of pearls, and the streets are paved in gold. And that the city glows from within because Christ is enthroned in the center of the city, and his light fills the city. And all of this description is built into the aesthetics of Byzantine architecture that has, beautiful marble pavements and paneling, and beautiful bronze doors, and jewel-like chandeliers, and that it seems to glow from within, the light reflecting off all of the golden icons and golden lamps. And it's an introverted experience. You don't have much awareness of what's outside through the windows in a Byzantine church. The windows are up high and they're small, and you have this sort of eternal awareness that when you step into a church, it's always heaven in there. We see this in the aesthetic of the chanting and the liturgical ceremony as well. That Orthodox services, they don't seem to have a clear beginning or a clear end. Every service kind of seamlessly blends into the next service. Mm-hmm. In a monastic setting, the services are almost nonstop, kind of overlapping one another. The choir singing, alternating with the clergy chanting, and back and forth. And again and again we pray to the Lord, and so forth. And there's this meditative quality to Orthodox services that you step into that aesthetic, and you have the chanting and the incense, and you've stepped outside of time. And so this continuity of liturgical aesthetic, it's been going on for millennia. Orthodox services looked like that thousands of years ago, and they look like that to this day. And in order to support that liturgical aesthetic, the architecture, works a certain way. That's not to say that all Orthodox churches need to stylistically look exactly the same. Obviously, there's variation from one country to another, and from one century to another in the superficials of Orthodox architecture. But in terms of fundamentally what it's trying to do, the icon of heaven that it's presenting, it's always worked that same way. And that's not something you can say about Western architecture. A Gothic church or a Baroque church or a modernistic church are not trying to do the same thing. They're trying to give you fundamentally different aesthetic visions, a different way of engaging with the sublime. So when I encountered Orthodox architecture, I thought, well, this is actually a really great system from the perspective of a liturgical designer, because I know what it's trying to do, which means that I have some measure of success that I can measure my own work against. I can design a church with a specific purpose, and then when it's done, I can step into a service there, and I can judge, is this doing what it's supposed to do? Does it make me feel like I've stepped into heaven? Does it work fundamentally the same way that, a medieval Orthodox church works? And, and generally, the clients, the clergy, the parish councils, they're, if they're a church that's hiring me, they typically have, a sufficient understanding of how liturgical art is supposed to work, that they're on the same page with me about that. They're trying to achieve that same vision. So that's kind of the interplay that, I was drawn to Orthodoxy because it offered a coherent system, a goalpost that I could aim towards. And Orthodoxy has taught me how to design by showing me this, this icon of heaven that's consistent with the canonical scriptural description of heaven. It's grounded in scriptural reality. It's not just an arbitrary tradition that some artist invented. And that, that's really appealing to me.
In the 90s, I was going to a mega church, and I have to say, I'm getting a question where I ask you about very, very, very modern churches, but it wasn't that. It wasn't certainly Orthodox looking at all, but it looked more like a garish theater type thing. I would say he's the pastor, John Hagee, is still massively famous and massively wealthy. And so that was a little bit, it almost looked like some sort of White House event. There was red carpet, blue carpet, white everywhere. And then unfortunately for 20-something years, I was an atheist going to no churches. And the first church I went to after finding Christ was an Orthodox church. And that's what I have my own church. Then I've gone to a few different churches in different cities that are Orthodox. However, since then, I've also seen pictures or videos where it's a very modern, non-Orthodox church, almost like I would say like a convention center, or maybe the church part of it inside looks like a massive conference room at a hotel with screens with lyrics or something like that. I've never been in something like that, so I'm not trying to tell everyone out there, hey, I've got this experience. It's just what I've seen. And I want to ask you, I think if I were to push back on someone, which I probably would not do, if I were to push back on someone attending a place like that, they could say the whole Matthew 18, wherever there's two or three of us, the Lord says he's there. Would they say something like, well, Andrew, it doesn't need to look a certain way. Christ says wherever there's two or three of us, he's there. So even if it's a square, gray cinder block place with fancy light patterns, it looks like a hotel conference room, it's still a church to me. How would you answer something like that?
Sure. Well, in a sense, the sort of auditorium church is it's sort of the logical conclusion of where Western church architecture has been going for a long time. As the Western church, particularly Protestants, started to lose the sort of liturgical worship emphasis of church services and reorient that emphasis towards preaching. This all started with the Reformation, that Protestant churches, installed pews. The service became less and less about the Eucharist and more about very long sermons. And as a result, it becomes more and more of a spectator activity that, you go to sit in your seat and listen to the vicar preach. And once you're on that path, we see, we see a line of development of church architecture that ultimately brings us to sort of the Vatican II Catholic Church, where it's church in the round, that the altar is in the middle, all the pews face it, no sight lines are obstructed, and of course in post-Vatican II Catholic masses, even though it's still a Eucharistic service, it's performative. The priest behaves often like he's putting on a show. He's got a microphone. He's sort of moving back and forth, calling a lot of attention to himself. And that sits very awkwardly with the Catholic Mass. But if you take the Mass part out of it, and all you're left with is the church in the round and the minister with a microphone, well, why not just abandon all pretense of church architecture and just have an auditorium, have a stage and, inclined seating with comfortable chairs and, a rock band and, celebrity guests. And why not just have church turn into a, consumer entertainment? I don't want to say that's wrong. I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with a lot of Christians getting together in an auditorium and hearing inspiring speeches and listening to rock music. People can do that if they want to do that, but it's simply not at all the same thing that an Orthodox church holding an Orthodox service is trying to do. We don't go to an Orthodox church for consumer entertainment. We go there to participate in the sort of eternal church's ongoing worship of God. If we're sort of to believe the church out through time, outside of time, all gets together to say our prayers to worship God, and we say these prayers in concert with the saints and angels in heaven. We're stepping outside of time and into that eternal heavenly worship, which of course is also biblically based. There's plenty of descriptions in the sort of prophetic literature of Scripture that describe, the worship of the saints and angels in heaven, the hosts of heaven, that's the type of worship that an Orthodox Church is designed to optimize, you might say. And it's an interesting question, that like a Protestant evangelical might ask, like, why do you need that? Well, the answer is really that you don't need that. I mean, I'm not going to say that there's no salvation without Byzantine architecture. That would be ridiculous. Right. Yes, you can worship God, in the forest or in your house or wearing blue jeans, or at a rock concert. Sure, Christians can gather and worship God under any circumstance. But the Orthodox Church isn't doing what it does because we need it. We're doing it because it's helpful. We like to say that the church is a hospital for sinners. It's right. Like if we were perfect, we wouldn't need to go to church. Yeah. There's even Orthodox saints who don't go to church. The hermits. In the monastic tradition, there are monks who achieve such a high level of spiritual accomplishment that they don't actually need to go to church anymore. They live in a cave and they worship God in the wilderness. And you can do that if you have a certain level of spiritual development. But for normal people who live in the distracting world, it's like we're not likely to be constantly mindful of God because, we have busy, distracting modern lives. And it's really helpful for us to be able to step into a space that is an icon of heaven, where all we see in that space is the worship of God. All we see is sublime divine beauty. And, at least once a week, we should step into that space. We should immerse ourselves in the sound of the chanting. No matter how distracted our minds may be, if that church architecture is really, really beautiful, really, really intense and complete, it's going to knock our attention out of where it normally is and put our attention in God. Hopefully for that 2 hours a week that we're there in church, and that's spiritually really efficacious. It's a very good service that the Orthodox Church offers to people who are willing to put themselves into that space and sort of acclimate themselves to that experience of heaven.
Yeah, I guess if I was thinking, as you said, the analogy that's the hospital for the soul, I suppose if I broke my leg, I could get it fixed as long as there's proper medical care in a forest, at a hotel room, at a conference center, but I would prefer to get it fixed at the hospital. So there you have it. I want to ask you about architecture in general and maybe where some things have changed. Do you think, let's say, postmodernism or moral relativism, that worldview has impacted architecture as we see it now? Or as it's presented to us now, maybe not as we see it?
Well, yes. I think, I probably have to back up a little bit and talk about modernism before postmodernism.
Okay.
Beautiful architecture almost completely died in the mid-20th century with the modern movement. The modern movement had a new anthropology, sort of the belief that modern man is a fundamentally different creature from historical man, and therefore requires a fundamentally different artistic expression, one that is functional and, rooted in science and sociology. Buildings are machines for living in. There's no place for ornament anymore. And we've grown out of primitive ideas like, solid walls, and buildings have to have walls made out of glass, and there's no clear difference between indoors and outdoors. All of this is symbolic of man having sort of evolved and transcended his old boundaries and, turned into the sort of, the Übermensch that Nietzsche envisioned. This is the philosophy of modernism. It's of course incompatible with Christianity. The Christian idea of salvation depends on an anthropology in which we are the same entity as historical man, the same entity as Christ, the same type of thing as Christ incarnate. If we have evolved into sort of a new species that has transcended all boundaries, the way Nietzsche envisioned, how can we partake of the salvation of Christ? So I really believe that modernism as a philosophy is a heresy in the specific sense, like incompatible with Christian salvation. Mm-hmm. And the architecture that came out of modernism likewise has absolutely no room for being an icon of the kingdom of heaven. But at least modernism, was something. At least it believed in something. It might have been a unchristian belief, but at least it was, confident in this new type of, severe utilitarian machine-like beauty, that the 20th century modernists believed in. So, there's a confidence in modernism that, that one can admire, sort of like one can admire the resolute confidence of a genuine atheist.
Sure.
But just like genuine atheists have become very rare nowadays, sort of the belief in architecture has become rare. And I think, just like postmodernism has kind of killed off this sincere belief in almost everything, people no longer really believe in architecture or style anymore. And when I meet like ordinary people out in the world and talk to them about buildings, everybody sort of likes a nice looking building, but most people don't really care. Most people are pretty indifferent to buildings. They don't care that much whether it's a decent looking modern building or a decent looking historical building. They don't really look at it. They just go about their lives. They don't really care that they live in a boring house, with plastic windows. I find architectural apathy to be, the most common, relationship to art nowadays. It's not just architecture; it's all the arts. People don't really care what pictures are hanging on the walls.
Right.
People don't really spend any real money on buying art that's worth anything. The most, when I go to like your typical affluent American neighborhood, people who have $1 million houses, the houses are big, but they're basically junk. They're all just sheetrock and plastic windows and asphalt roofs. The art, the furniture and the art is basically junk. It's just boring stuff that you can buy at a department store. The pictures just are sort of like framed botanical prints like you'd see in a hotel room.
Right.
It's just like nobody cares. Nobody's even bothering to pick a sense of style. And that's sort of where we are with postmodernism. It's like modernist architecture was such a failure, and then along come the postmodernists who basically say, it didn't matter anyway. It's all just a joke. And that's basically where people are at.
What's up, guys? Your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson here. And you might notice this recording sounds different than the usual podcast. And that is because I'm sitting outside here in Lockhart, Texas, recording this ad into my iPhone. It probably sounds pretty crappy. Well, I'm doing this to show you something very cool. Many of you guys know that my production team works over at Podsworth Media, and they've been producing my show for quite a while. I get a lot of questions and people asking, who does your podcast? Why does it sound great? And I'm telling you why. It's because the guys at Podsworth are amazing. they've got this brand new online app for taking rough recordings like this and making them a whole lot cleaner and more listenable with just a few easy clicks. It will remove background noise, it reduces plosives, it fixes clipping, which is distortion from recording with the gain up too high, clipping, which is distortion from recording with the gain up too high, which I can promise you I've done many times, and they fixed this for me. It removes clicks and pops. And then also levels out the dialogue, so there's no crazy where the guest sounds too loud or the interviewer sounds too quiet. Here's what you guys can do. All of y'all that are interested in recording podcasts or audiobooks or anything, if you're a pastor and you want your sermon recorded, whatever the case may be, go to podsworth.com and click Get Started. You drag and drop your audio files or click to open your file manager. This also works on your smartphone's web browser. You customize your settings that you want, but the default works fine on most podcast recordings. Then enter code BUCK50, BUCK50 for 50% off of your first order. You don't need an account, just an email address and payment. And you'll get a download link in your email for your cleaned up files. How cool is this? The guys at Podsworth run everything they do through this app before they do anything else to it. So all of my recordings go through this app that we're talking about. It works great. Like I said, any spoken word recordings, obviously for podcasts, YouTube videos, sermons, audiobooks, whatever, it will make awful recordings sound listenable and much more professional. So, like I said, go to podsworth.com and click Get Started. You can use promo code BUCK50, BUCK50 for 50% off of your first order. You can use promo code BUCK50, BUCK50 for 50% off of your first order. Let's get it.
Yeah, there's one of the things I've heard when I speak to, let's say, someone with just kind of like you're saying, a generic who at least pretends to appreciate generic modern structures. For instance, I live in a small town called Lockhart, Texas. We've got a town square that's very historical, very old. The same buildings are all still there. It's very nice looking, beautiful. And they're putting next to it, the one empty spot they have, they're putting one of these angular gray mixed-use buildings that we're all familiar with. They're very ugly. And I've complained about that. And I've heard someone say, well, you can't make it like they used to because it's just too expensive now. These are the cheaper ways to do it. And it still has the same function. It houses things. There's no function of beauty, certainly, but to put four walls and a ceiling around something that you need inside, I guess, is the utilitarian aspect of it. But is there any truth to this stuff about that's too expensive to build like they used to?
No, that's not true at all. Building a good building, that has good proportions and orderly fenestration, that uses materials in a sensible, traditional way, that doesn't cost anything more than building a sort of irrational, crummy building. Particularly because a lot of the most beautiful old buildings are actually really simple. You go to an old city with a historic district. It may have a few very grand buildings that were expensive in their time, but just most ordinary old buildings are really simple. They're not much ornamentation. They're just, a brick box, regularly spaced windows, nicely proportioned. They're actually really simple compared to even ordinary modern buildings. And it's been well demonstrated by all sorts of developers and classical architects that you can build, good classical architecture for the same price that you can build modern architecture, of comparable quality and finishes. So that's not true at all. It's really just a preference of developers. Most developers will choose the easy path of just hiring a run-of-the-mill commercial architecture firm that just churns out ordinary buildings, rather than making the extra effort to find a classical architect, who will design a really beautiful building. It's a little bit more effort. It's not much more. It's not more money.
Right. There's my girlfriend is very much into old architecture. I showed her your stuff, and she was just in love with it. And she often tells me when she's surrounded by complete modernity, like these weird angular gray buildings, and she says that it hurts her soul to be amongst this, and that the actual architecture aspect of it's evil. Now, maybe that's putting it a little bit harshly or strongly. Do you sense any of that from like this, what I would call ugly modernity aspect of architecture?
Well, sure. I mean, all art is expressive of ideas and attitudes. It's all iconic of something. Yeah, and for sure, you can see, like, in brutalist architecture, for instance, concrete brutalism of the 1960s. I mean, it's an expression of the sort of nihilistic totalitarianism of the mid 20th century.
Right.
I mean, the architects who designed those buildings named it brutalism. I mean,
Right.
they weren't designing those buildings because they thought that was pretty. I mean, they were designing them because they knew it was ugly, because they were trying to express a really ugly, state of mankind. The condition that the aftermath of World War II left Europe in. So. Don't assume that architects just have different taste and are trying to do something nice and beautiful in different ways. I mean, sometimes architects are actually trying to design sinister-looking buildings, either because they themselves have a sinister philosophy about humanity, or because they just, are in despair about the state of the modern world and are trying to honestly express that. Nowadays, I think most ugly buildings are just inept. Most architects nowadays are not very good at the artistic side of what they do. Buildings have become so complicated that architects nowadays need to be experts in, structures and ductwork and financing and zoning rules and building codes. Right. And, modern commercial architects tend to be really good at all of that sort of engineering and utilitarian kind of stuff. They tend not to be good at all at aesthetics. And so buildings are just kind of ineptly designed from an aesthetic standpoint, even if they might, function really well from like an air conditioning, and
right.
Electrical services and
Sure.
plumbing standpoint. I mean, modern buildings work fantastically well compared to old buildings from
Right.
those standpoints. But that's one of the difficulties with modern architecture, honestly, is that buildings have become so complicated. So much is expected of them. All those beautiful 19th century buildings, they didn't have any mechanical systems. They were just walls and a roof.
Sure.
They made the walls and the roof really, really beautiful.
Right.
Because architects' job was to make walls and roofs really beautiful.
Wow.
They didn't have to be experts in, ductwork and plumbing and so forth.
Sure.
Building codes.
Right. It's interesting as they become more complex, as you're saying. I'm a firefighter by trade, and we study building construction, type 1, type 2, type 3, et cetera. One thing I do know for sure, they may be more complicated now and have more codes to follow, but when they're burning, they're much more dangerous than the old ones. The old, let's say pre-1940, if those catch on fire, it's a lot safer for us. Not that that's what they're going to build houses for, the safety of firefighters when they burn, but just an interesting side note. And I find it interesting too, the boring, I would call boring or banal style of some of the modern architecture. Speaking of it, harming your soul, my spiritual father is Father Turbo Qualls. He says there's 3 ways in which demons work, and it's like boorish, boring, and banal, or something like that. And it was like, as you're talking, like, it's almost like he's describing modern architecture, interestingly enough. I want to ask you about the challenge of, obviously, when you're going to design, let's say, a Russian Orthodox church, a Rokor church in South Carolina, or, different places in America have their own kind of unique style that don't necessarily fit with, let's say, a Russian Orthodox church. What's the challenge with that as far as, because in Orthodoxy, and correct me if I'm wrong, we don't usually go into a foreign land with this puritanical outlook, like we're going to put our thing here and hope you like it. It's more of a we will meet you where you're at and kind of respect each other's beauty back and forth. Is there a challenge in that?
Well, sure. Yeah, I mean, when we look at the old world, each Orthodox country has its own stylistic expression in their churches and their art, and it's pretty obvious looking at those churches that the stylistic expression derives from the climate, the geography, the cultural background of those places. I like to say, like, look at how churches on Greek islands, they're painted white and turquoise, and they're domed, and they mirror the actual formal appearance of the Greek islands. Marble hills rising out of a turquoise sea. They look like they grew naturally in that landscape. Versus like churches in Romania that have these pointy roofs with tall wooden steeples, and these churches are nestled in pine forests, and they're mirroring the shapes of the pine trees, or the churches in the Republic of Georgia that are, have these pointy conical sandstone roofs that mirror the shape of the jagged mountains of that Caucasian landscape, or the Russian churches that have their gilded onion domes on top, that they express the Russian idea of Holy Russia, that the very landscape is sanctified, and that the Holy Spirit has come down and covered the landscape of Russia with tongues of fire, the gilded onion domes that sparkle on the horizon around these medieval cities. Each country has developed its own way of expressing the presence of God, sanctifying the landscape. And so it's really important with Orthodox design, to inculturate our church architecture wherever we are. That's really the particular thrust of my own work. I don't think Orthodoxy has been very good at doing this in America in the 20th century. We have an awful lot of churches that simply seek to be a copy of a Greek or a Russian church, dropped down in Middle America. And that's not very good art. We really need to figure out how to take our American building traditions, our American sensibility about, materials, and figure out how to build an icon of heaven in our own way. And so I've been doing that. I make a lot of use of timber frame because that feels like a really American tradition of building, where, historically we are a nation of wood. We had forests when Europe, no longer did. We have a great tradition of robust building with timber beams and trusses. We have a really good tradition of 19th century church building, that was influenced by the Gothic revival and the arts and crafts movement that preached honest expression of structure. Let your walls and your arches be made of brick or stone. Let your roofs, your beams and trusses be made out of timber. Let your light fixtures be wrought iron. Use each material in its most natural place, its most natural expression. And I think Americans still have a love of this sort of, hardy, no nonsense, get it done right, do it in a simple and rational way, that we kind of derive from, the culture of the Shakers, 19th century sort of, rural great revival kind of sensibilities, And I think it's important that we build our churches in that way. Our churches should not be, dripping with ornament the way like a Ukrainian Baroque Orthodox church would be. It's like we've never had that kind of artistic expression in America. We're not a Baroque culture, honestly, we are a Protestant culture in America, and Orthodoxy has to own that. We may not be Protestants, we may not endorse Protestant theology, but nevertheless, we have a building tradition that comes out of Protestantism, and we need to baptize that. We need to take that kind of hardy and rational approach to building things and say, we can work with that. Let's figure out how to take that and turn that into an icon of heaven.
Mm.
And it's not going to look the same as, Orthodox churches in Ukraine. It's going to look very different from that. But that's our job as, worshiping God in America, is to figure out how to do that.
Do you think, I guess for lack of a better phrase, just broadly speaking, modernity has had any effect on how we view beauty and love?
Well, I mean, modernism, as in, the 20th century
Yes.
philosophy I described, honestly doesn't have much place for beauty or love.
Mm.
It's the totalitarian philosophies that defined the 20th century are very much truth first. That is to say, whether it's sort of, right-wing fascism or left-wing communism, these philosophies had a rational truth of their own, and they were willing to, burn everything down in order to promote, that rational philosophy taking over the world. And this kind of truth first, to hell with beauty attitude, it leaves a lot of slaughter and destruction in its wake. That kind of totalitarian is impossible with a beauty first worldview, because you would have to pause and say, like, what we're doing to the world, in furthering this totalitarian system, it's ugly. I mean, we're killing people, we're enslaving people, we're taking away freedoms, we're destroying everything that historically was built. This is obviously anti-beauty,
Right.
and anti-love.
Right.
Therefore, it's wrong.
Right.
That's the Christian Orthodox worldview is beauty first. It's like,
Yes.
anything we might think we're doing, based on some rational philosophy, we need to test it against beauty. If it's ugly, if it's depriving people of freedom, if it's forcing people against their will, and it's basically tearing down the world rather than building it up, well, we're making a mistake, because beauty and love are the ultimate measure. It's like, you don't trick people with beauty. I mean, people know beauty when they see it, and people know love when they see it.
Mhm.
Whereas truth, that's an elusive concept.
Yes.
I mean, people can be very deluded when it comes to truth and rational philosophy. I mean, you can very easily talk somebody into being a Nazi or being a communist, with a rational argument. But if you train people to focus on beauty first and love, then it's not so easy to trick them. They're going to step back and realize that things are going off the rails.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And shout out to Timothy Patistas,
Exactly.
Ethics of Beauty. He was on the show, I guess, a year or so ago. Let me ask you about, I have to know this, when I'm trying to picture a regular person who's not necessarily in love with old architecture, but might appreciate it. Let's say that's not like a historian or a nerd about it. When they walk into one of your designs, one of your buildings, have you seen just kind of ordinary people have spectacular reactions?
Yeah, I have. It's interesting because particularly younger people, like, the hipster generation, they tend to really, really like my buildings, often to a degree that surprises them themselves. Like,
Okay.
they're not necessarily architecture enthusiasts. They might not have ever paid a whole lot of attention to historical architecture. But yeah, they react really well to the particular the particular note that my buildings hit of sort of expressing something of, the sublime, of sort of the presence of God, but doing it in a way that, that feels like it's our own culture, that does it in a fairly straightforward and understandable way,
Right.
rather than with a whole lot of, plaster and ornamentation, the way like a 19th century Catholic church might. So yeah, I've got a lot of fans, of like in their 20s who like absolutely adore my buildings, and it's a curious phenomenon to me. I mean, I appreciate their enthusiasm.
It's funny you said hipster, because it got me thinking. I've been, I like to frequent different bars when I'm traveling. There is kind of a neat trend now of the old school bartender wearing the bow tie and the vest,
Mm-hmm.
and trying to actually appreciate the craft of making an actual cocktail, rather than just being fancy and throwing a bunch of garbage, sugar, alcohol in. And there is this trend I've seen in certain old style cities that where I could see the young people appreciating what you do, and I assume you've seen that in South Carolina as well.
Yeah, it's funny because nowadays, like, bars and restaurants are oftentimes the place where people put the most artistic attention into achieving a really, really coherent stylistic note. Somebody who opens a high-end bar or restaurant, they've got a vision. And it goes down to like how they mix their cocktails and how the bartender dresses and what the bar top is made of.
Yeah.
And what kind of retro light bulbs are in the light fixture, what music track is playing, what kind of font they have on their signage, and every little thing is chosen with intense care, just to reflect a really consistent and coherent flavor that restaurateur has chosen. And I really admire that. That's wonderful to see people putting that kind of artistic attention into something. It's the kind of attention that in the early 20th century would have been put into churches.
Yes.
Or into really, really nice mansions for Gilded Age robber barons.
Right.
It's funny that nowadays rarely do churches have any attention like that put into them.
Right.
They're mostly just functional auditoriums.
Yes.
And even houses for rich people. I mean, even multi-million-dollar mansions actually seldom nowadays have that kind of attention put into them.
Right.
But yeah, it's the really nice bars and restaurants where you see that. They're sort of the churches and the palaces of the present age.
As someone who appreciates art like you do, is there, obviously it seems to me with digital, with everything being digital and moving that way, I've started to see AI quote unquote, replace art, to where companies just pump out something. I suppose you just type it in what you want and it pumps out this quote unquote art designed on the spot by a algorithm or a computer, however these guys do it. What are your thoughts on the future of actual art as far as running into this giant of AI?
Yeah, well, I think AI is going to take over a lot of artistic design, but it's not going to take it over everywhere. It's going to take over the simple stuff. Rather than the complex stuff. Like, if you just need a logo designed, yeah, I'm sure AI can design your logo instantly, and it can probably give you 20 good options to choose from, and it'll be just fine. But I don't think AI is going to be able to like design buildings. It can certainly give you a picture of a beautiful building. I mean, Facebook is already rampant with so-called AI-designed buildings, and they'll show you a picture of some spectacular, romantic-looking building that'll knock your socks off. But that doesn't mean it's really designed that building. It's just made a picture of a compelling building. But it's like, is the floor plan practical? Is the roof going to leak? Is there room for the ductwork and the air conditioning equipment? Does it meet building codes? It's like designing a building takes a vast knowledge, and it takes balancing all these different priorities. And I don't think AI is going to be able to do that the way it presently works. I mean, I can't predict how sophisticated AI may become in the distant future, but at least the large language model of AI, where it's simply, superficially perusing all the stuff on the internet and just kind of superficially pulling a picture of a building from here and pulling a picture of a building here and fusing them together to give you the picture that it thinks is going to seduce you. It's like, that it can produce a seductive picture of a building, but there's no data in that data set that's actually telling it how to really make that building function and meet code and all that. It's so I don't see AI being able to like be an architect in that sense.
Right.
I don't think AI is going to be able to like make movies for the same reason. It's like AI can definitely make like a little snippet of a movie. It can definitely like, imitate some, spaceship battle scene because it's got a bunch of movies that have that it can draw from, and it can imitate that. But to actually make an entire movie that's got all the subtleties of a compelling plot and all the subtleties of consistent artistic design and directing running through it,
which is more rare these days, but go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, will AI get there in 100 years? I have no idea. I can't predict that. But I don't think the way AI is conceived right now is going to be able to do something as complex as that.
What are some of the cities in America that you find there to be beautiful architecture? Some of your favorites?
Well, I mean, I really like the old and historic cities in America, like my own city of Charleston. Is really beautiful. We've got, almost the whole downtown of the city is, really nice 18th and 19th century buildings at a very human scale, very walkable. But I also really enjoy, the city centers that were built up in like the late 19th and early 20th century with, big, beautiful office buildings, in the Gilded Age when a lot of money was put into, really impressive building facades, Art Deco banks and corporate headquarters.
Yeah.
I love those really, really optimistic buildings, of the teens and 20s. Almost every American city has beautiful, beautiful buildings like that. I actually love traveling America. I do a lot of business travel to kind of, middle America cities just because, a lot of churches hire me to come and make consultation visits to look at their property. And, so I find myself in a lot of, Rust Belt cities or Midwestern cities that, are not tourist destinations, but tend to have a lot of really good early 20th century commercial architecture, really beautiful churches and art museums, that were built back when those middle American cities were super wealthy.
Right.
It would be wonderful if some of those kind of depressed American cities, if people would start moving back into them and build them up again, because they have the architecture and the infrastructure to be really great places again.
Yes. What about San Francisco?
Yeah, I mean, San Francisco is blessed with an amazing natural setting. Lots of grand buildings. Really, the housing is at a very human scale. Kind of by necessity because of their earthquake situation. Like they kind of have to build low-rise buildings. It's a gorgeous place.
It's amazing what you can find a city that beautiful, and then look what happens to it. It's almost it's wild. Talk about that school that you're on the board of. I want people to hear about this. The college.
Yeah. So here in Charleston, we have a unique college, the American College of the Building Arts, and it's America's only 4-year liberal arts college that grants bachelor's degrees in traditional building trades. So you can major in timber framing, architectural fine carpentry, blacksmithing, architectural stone carving, classical plastering, and classical architectural design. And it's a real liberal arts college, so it's not a trade school in the sense that you take classes in language and math and science and English, but all of those classes are geared towards what you should know in those fields that are going to help you in your trade career that you're being trained for. So if you study blacksmithing, for instance, you're gonna get a lot of shop time where you learn how to wield a hammer and forge iron, but you're also going to be taking art history classes about the history of architectural styles and the place of blacksmithing in the history of art, and you're going to be taking science classes that are going to be teaching you metallurgy, so you know how understand your materials, and you're going to be taking English classes that are going to be training you in the vocabulary of talking about art and talking to clients about art and style and history for your commissions, and foreign language classes that are going to be gearing you towards travel and study and in France or Germany, where you can get furthering your education in these historical trades. So their motto is creating educated artisans, and I really, really highly recommend it. If there's any young people out there who are interested in going into a traditional trade as a serious career, look into the American College of the Building Arts. It'll give you an education and a career path that is nowhere else can offer this.
Excellent. I'm going to link to that in the show notes page for this. Do you get a sense from where you sit and what you do that Orthodoxy is growing at a rapid rate in America?
Well, you certainly in a certain demographic it is that we've got loads and loads of young people, mostly young men, mostly in their 20s who are showing up at Orthodox churches. Mm-hmm. It's a really interesting phenomenon because I remember like 15, 20 years ago, virtually everybody who showed up at Orthodox churches interested in becoming Orthodox were people who were already experienced churchgoers and were like making a denominational change because they were fed up with some weirdness in whatever denomination they were coming from. But almost everybody who shows up at Orthodox churches now are people who have never been churchgoers, never been Christians, and are learning about this stuff from scratch, mostly with, things they heard about on YouTube, started reading about patristic theology and church history and, just decide they're going to show up at an Orthodox church. It's a wonderful thing. It's kind of throwing the Orthodox Church for a loop in terms of, catechesis. We've never really had the experience of having to train people in the Christian life and the Christian worldview from scratch. That's going to be a new thing the Orthodox Church has to learn how to do, and but it's also going to help the Orthodox Church get over some of its cultural problems. The Orthodox Church tends to have kind of an anti-Western bias, and that's because we're full of people who converted out of Western denominations, because of some problem that they experienced there. And it's full of people who come from old world countries, like Ukraine, that have centuries of history of like Catholic Orthodox religious conflict. And, but now that the new generation of Orthodox people, don't have that background, are approaching Orthodoxy just out of love and enthusiasm for what Orthodoxy can offer, I think that's going to put us in a really good position for setting aside that Western bias and that historical baggage really embracing orthodoxy as a natural expression of the love of God among Americans. And that's it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's going to be a really good thing, because I see this new generation of converts reacting very well to the kind of liturgical art that I promote. They love that it takes their American culture, their American heritage, and reorients it towards the worship of God in a way that's consistent with Scripture and tradition. It's very simple for them,
Yeah, well put. That's and speaking of the stuff you promote, plug anything you'd like, websites, social media presence, where people can find your work, any of it, where they can contact you if they want to have you work for them.
Sure. Well, my website is newworldbyzantine.com. And I've got lots of pictures of the buildings and furnishings that I've designed on there, and that has links to articles I've written and books that feature my work. And then I also run an online journal, orthodoxartsjournal.org, and that journal features comprehensive articles about Orthodox liturgical art. I've written many articles on there, but also my colleagues, iconographers, musicians, art historians. We have hundreds of articles on there, and for anyone who wants to really dig into the sort of art theory of these Orthodox liturgical arts, and get a sense of all the different practitioners, the professional iconographers and musicians who are doing interesting work nowadays, peruse the Orthodox Arts Journal. It's actually almost unique in the world, even in Orthodox countries in the old world. The Orthodox Arts Journal is pretty respected and well known.
Cool. I'm going to link to all of that in the show notes page as well. Andrew Gould, thank you for being here on Counterflow.
All right. It was my pleasure. Thank you.
Yes, sir. All right. I hope you guys enjoyed that. These drop, as you probably know, every Tuesday night around 7 p.m. Central Time. I always announce it on Twitter, where you can follow me at BuckRebel, BuckRebel. They premiere then. I'm in the live text, in the live chat to have fun and discuss things with you as the episode plays out. And one really easy way to figure it out is go to the YouTube page for the YouTube channel for Counterflow with Buck Johnson. Hit subscribe. You will get notified about an hour, I'd say, or so before they premiere. Maybe it's 30 minutes, but you will be notified. And like my good friend of the show, Tatiana, told me, you better go check to make sure you're still subscribed if you were. And she said, oh my goodness, YouTube knocked me out of my subscription status to your page. So she had to go subscribe to it. So maybe go check that just in case. And you will get to watch these. You'll be notified when they come out. And I hope you're enjoying these. I love getting in that live chat with you guys. Let's see. Like I said, I'm on Twitter at BuckRebel. We've got the Patreon group. I told you about that. We've got the Telegram group. If you use Telegram, search Counterflow with Buck Johnson. We have all kinds of fun discussions in there. And I'd say that's about it. Counterflowpodcast.com is the website, guys. And until next week, y'all have a good one. We'll see you soon.
You get split in half, like on the hologram graph. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid, and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Like the sound of the Counterflow podcast? Our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.